the wonderful women of the Stanek Gallery have done it again. Actually, they have outdone themselves again by bringing a museum-quality show to their exciting Philadelphia gallery. And the idea for the show came from a tall and likable Californian.
Well, my name is John Seed, and I'm the curator of Disrupted Realism, so I want to welcome you to the Stanek Gallery. You know, last night at the opening, I had some questions about how did you curate the show, and the answer that came to mind was about 700 emails. It really is a show that came from the internet and from social media. It started with 7 years of blogging for the Huffington Post.
I did a blog on the topic of discombobulation, which was the very, very first thing that my friends and I started calling this phenomenon. The term came from F.Scott, who's a painter, who is very, very interested in motion in art. And he gave a lecture, I heard, where he just pointed out, really across time and into contemporary art, this trend for realism to be broken up in one way or another, sometimes by motion, sometimes by blurs, sometimes by something conceptual. And that's the backstory of contemporary disruption. Vanessa Waring of the Stanek Gallery read the blog, and she said later that she was only about halfway through the blog when she said, this could be a great show. So they contacted me, and we've been working on assembling this for more than a year. I showed the Stanek Gallery over 50 artists whose work I'd seen in person and online, and we worked with artists that were available to us. In some cases, for example, the artist Anne Gale, we would have liked to have, but she had other commitments and couldn't give us work. So I want to make sure when people see the show that I'm not saying with my curation, these are the only artists doing it. It's more like saying, here's a sampling, and you can get an idea where this tendency can go in different directions from some of these approaches and careers.
We identified a few key artists, and Alex was one of them. And I have to say, I see Alex as one of the leaders of this tendency.
On the day I went to see the show, the gallery had planned a symposium. I'll get to that later. But one of the panelists was an artist in the show.
My name is Stanek Gallery, Croatian by origin. That history has actually helped my work quite a bit in travels to Croatia and movings around the world. It's given me this openness and the ability to let go of my traditional artistic background. Letting go of a plan, letting go of some sort of formula in my head. I jumped down that rabbit hole of unknowing, and I'm able to explore further what the paint is telling me to do so that each piece becomes something different, unique to itself and unique to what came before in my own work.
The thing I like about the show, you know, seeing it all together, there's enough in common between the artists for a theme, but there's enough difference to make it interesting.
Something I've been hearing a lot as a writer, people say that straight realism is mimetic. It's one of those poison terms like kitsch that kills the achievement of artists with words. I have a very high regard for realism, but I do see the point that realist artists may not be able to say everything they would want to say with realism. And there's a generation now of artists who have come out of the atelier movement, or who have been very highly trained in traditional skills, meaning the Renaissance skills of form and volume and light and space. And so what's happening, I think, across the globe is that more and more artists are saying to themselves, well, I've got these kinds of skills, What can I do with them? How can I break them up? How can I make variations? How can I improvise?
It's a work with pastel and graphite on mylar, and Anne has extraordinary drafting skills. In fact, she's a big fan of Leonardo da Vinci. That's where a lot of her ideas come from.
One of my favorites in the show, Robert Bermelin, has been a fixture in the art world since the 1980s. Critic Donald Cuspit wrote in Art Forum, "Bermelin's paintings are brilliant in the way they confront us with a variety of urban spaces and surfaces, including human surfaces." His is a tough-minded realism. These are not a tourist's pictures. They flatter no one and are full of psychological as well as material detail.
There's a lot of different motivations, ranging from narrative, sometimes to respond to photography or digital imagery, that kind of disruption. Sometimes people want to deal with memory, and I have a quote in the catalog essay from Francis Bacon, who said that my paintings are blurred because my memories are blurred. And then there are just some formal reasons. Sometimes people want to improvise and simply bring out the palette knife or a rag or a different kind of brush and see what happens when there's spontaneity, when you bring kind of visual jazz into realism. But the key element is that these artists have it. They have the ability to do skilled realism, and they may have done it, and yet they go on and they do something different. They break it up. They disrupt it.
You may recognize another one of the symposium panelists from TV.
My name is David Weiss, and I am a Senior Vice President at Freeman's Auction House here in Philadelphia. Bruce Samuelson, I'm a big fan of his work. We have the female form rendered in great anatomical accuracy, but he has taken the form and broken it down into various component parts, disrupting what would be an otherwise fluid and complete rendering of a torso, and morphed it a little bit into different areas that are coherent, and then some areas here where there is a break between the upper arm and the lower arm. It's a really interesting technique, and it shows his skill as a draftsman and how inventive he is in showing the human form.
With the work of Kai Samuels Davis, I see a portrait in reverse, starting with the resemblance, and then there's a process of giving and taking away. So you're somewhere between memory and presence, and the result is spiritual.
If there's anybody that's a grandfather, it's probably Paul Cézanne. When photography came along and mechanized realism, I think that's really the moment when painting in all kinds of ways responded by becoming expressive and becoming something that was an artist's vision as opposed to a retelling of what the eye could see. We've all heard that statistic, more photos taken in the last 3 years than since the beginning of photography. Straight realism, it's an iPhone. Only a painter can do the kinds of variations that these artists are indulging in. Justin Bauer, who's in the show, really has a feeling of digital disruption, or something you'd see on a screen where the pixels appear and there's a digital thread that breaks its way through the images.
So there's an electronic disruption that's a theme in some of the work. I think photography and the history of mechanical image making is one of the very, very powerful contexts of disrupted realism. In the catalog for the show, we talk a little bit about photography. So I was delighted that James Bland sent a piece from Britain called The Photographer, and it's a double self-portrait. I guess you could say maybe it's an anti-selfie, because he shows himself both as a photographer and as his companion in the image. But it's a painter's take on seeing the self and seeing it through painting as referenced in photography.
I think the social and political implication is subjectivity. And that's something I also take back to Cézanne. These artists are all interested in the idea that the hard and the fast and the black and the white are very, very rare, or maybe even impossible. They're all in the gray areas of expression and memory and narrative. They are interested in the subjective and the changeable and the evanescent. By putting this show out there, I hope that in a positive way, there will be criticism and discussion, maybe refinement. I know my wife says to me, she says, John, you're a very interesting and creative guy, but you're not always accurate. So maybe people will look at some of my presumptions and some of my ideas and roll their eyes a bit and clarify. And that's exactly what should happen if this development is taken seriously.
Hi, my name is Ross Mitchell. I'm the former director of Barnes DeMazia Education and Outreach at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, and I'm pleased to be on the panel here at the Stanek Gallery.
I kind of see a scale between all the way from non-objective to pure realism and everything in between. And disrupted realism, depending on which piece you're looking at, is in the in-betweens.
Any other thoughts about that description of realism?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about the basic starting premise. So, disrupted realism takes realism as the starting point. It's implied that it's disruptive, of course, but I would say that it's not realism that's being disrupted, that the creative distortion is the starting point, and that to take realism as the starting point is, I think, missing the point of what artists do. So there's illustration. I would call that realism. If the main point of what the artist is trying to say is the story, then what we see here, and by the way, I love the show, it's something different than just disrupted realism. I would say that it's extremely expressive and decorative, and it has all of these other components, more than just having a bottom line of being disrupted realism.
You say illustration, are you referring it to historical context, somebody like Leyendecker or Norman Rockwell or something like that? Or
Well, I'm thinking along those lines, right, where the story is the most important thing that the artist wants to tell us.
To me, that, as much as a fan I am of illustration art, some of that borders slightly on commercial and even camp, some of it depending. Not so much in Norman Rockwell, although he's having a moment just now.
Well, when I was in art school, it was one of the poison words, like kitsch. You could kill a career with illustration, like they tried to kill Matisse with decorative.
Right.
But there's also something to be said for not relying on observational reality as well. It's not necessarily what we see in front of us. We may start that way. As for me, and I'm always starting with the actual person in realistic terms, and then taking that further into some other place with the paint. Yeah.
So I'm not defending
No,
it, right? In fact, I'm saying that a painting should be a record of an artist's experience.
Right.
So if you want reality, look out the window.
Yeah.
What an artist does is interprets it
Yeah.
through their expressive experiences.
I love the fact that you're using the word expression, and oddly enough, I got into it on Facebook with Blake Gottnick, who's writing Warhol's biography. He says, "Oh, expression, that's been debunked. We don't have that anymore. So some people don't even have expression."
Right.
Huh. Expert thought leaders debunking artistic expression? I'm not buying it. No one understands artistic expression better than Catherine Stanek. I asked her about the artists in this show. Here is some of what she said. Their work resonates profoundly with everyone, not just with artists. They are not simply taking a figure and breaking it up. They are emulating our world today, which is dramatically different than any other period in history. Technology has altered our attention span.
My food is being filmed.
We constantly scroll through our handheld devices, often viewing multiple images at once and flipping through a series of images every second. The eye doesn't have time to settle, and the brain doesn't have time to completely process what it has just seen before it is on to the next image. The amount of information is overwhelming, leaving one feeling anxious, unsure, and uneasy. Each artist is presenting recognizable figurative fragments, which allow us all to relate to the subject, but they are rendered in such a way that the eye does not have time to settle. This way of seeing, feeling, and expressing is happening all over the world among highly skilled painters. And thanks to our technology, we have an awareness of that fact. And the artists have an awareness of each other despite their living in very different parts of the country and the world.